Hi there. Today I want to talk about one of my favorite issues, freedom of expression. And I want to talk about my concern that the right to freedom of expression is being gradually hollowed out and eroded by speech-free zones that are kind of dotting our cities. These are called bubble zones. Now, what began as bubbles to prevent protests close to abortion clinics has now sort of jumped the shark, with now politicians are claiming that their offices need speech-free zones to protect them from members of the public who disagree with them. Now, this is a new proposal by Liberal MP Marco Mendocino, and the proposal that he's made is to criminalize protests near politicians' offices, and I think it's really troubling. It will undermine democracy, and it's just part of a really negative trend that has accelerated lately with this expansion of bubble zones across our cities. I can't wait to tell you all about it. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Christine, and I'm the litigation director at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. I upload regular videos about our ongoing legal cases and about other interesting developments in constitutional law in Canada. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, hit like and subscribe below. It really helps my videos out a lot when you like or subscribe or ring the notification bell. It helps push my videos through the YouTube algorithm, which in turn leads to more ad revenue that we use to fight our legal cases. Also, please remember that nothing in my videos is ever legal advice. If you have your own legal question or problem, consult your own lawyer. So let's talk about bubble zones. Bubble zones are also known as safe access laws, and they prohibit protests within defined geographic areas. So anyone who protests or has a demonstration within the protected bubble can face penalties, and sometimes those are criminal penalties. Bubble zones were originally developed to prevent protests and sidewalk counseling by pro-life demonstrators outside of abortion clinics. The first bubble zone law was introduced in 1995 in British Columbia. It was introduced in 1995, as I said, which was a few years after criminal bans on abortion were struck down. That happened in 1988. Now, the BC law prohibits protests, recordings, harassment, sidewalk interference, which is sometimes called sidewalk counseling. That's when protesters try to talk women out of getting an abortion. And it prohibits these types of protests in the bubble around abortion clinics and also around physicians' homes. And this law was actually introduced following some pretty serious violence in the 90s, including the bombing of the famous Morgentaler abortion clinic in Toronto in 1992 and the shooting of a Vancouver-based abortion physician in 1994. He survived the shooting, but obviously this is a terrible thing. So this law was introduced, and when they were first introduced and proposed, they were rightly opposed by groups like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the BC Civil Liberties Association. We didn't exist at that time, but I imagine if we had, we would have also opposed this type of law as an unjustified limit on freedom of expression. Now, I'm somewhat skeptical that the CCLA and the BCCLA would oppose abortion bubble zones if they were introduced today. But I do think that they are the wrong response to the problem of the violence that we saw physicians and abortion clinics experiencing. Violence is, of course, already criminalized, and those who are intent on committing criminal acts of violence won't be dissuaded because suddenly there's a 50-meter bubble zone around this space they had planned to commit murder. It's not like they'll be saying to themselves, oh, well, I want to murder this person, but I better not do it in this bubble. I mean, give me a break. I think the problem is the need to enforce the law. The bubble zone, the way it works, is a violation of the expressive rights of demonstrators. And if you want to deal with violence, harassment, blockading, all of that can be dealt with using existing laws. But bubble zones around abortion clinics, they have survived charter challenges. They were upheld in a 1996 decision called R.V. Lewis at the BC Supreme Court, where the court, in that case, R.V. Lewis, held that the bubble law violated the right to freedom of expression, but it was a justified limit on the right to freedom of expression. And in upholding that law, the court in BC held that healthcare has fundamental value in our society. A woman's right to access healthcare without unnecessary loss of privacy and dignity is no more than the right of every Canadian to access healthcare. So that's the state of the law. But what people may not have noticed is that law was upheld, but all of a sudden there has been what I would describe as a pretty rapid expansion in the use of bubble zones for all kinds of other purposes. And I'll just go through a few of them. They've happened recently. It all sort of seems to have started around 2018 when Ontario introduced an abortion safe access law, an abortion bubble law, but then it kind of went out into all kinds of other areas of expression. So in 2020, Calgary City Council passed the School Safe Zones bylaw amendment to prohibit what is called advocacy messaging on signs within 150 meters of a school boundary. So that's actually much larger than the 50 meters around abortion clinics in BC. Signs around schools that have any advocacy message cannot be larger than a piece of paper. The same year, Alberta enacted the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, which bans blockades and willfully entering on any essential infrastructure without lawful right, justification, or excuse. And this is a law that's been pretty widely criticized, including by us at the CCF, for violating charter rights. Blockades are already prohibited under existing law, and banning willfully entering on any essential infrastructure without lawful right, justification, or excuse is kind of just going too far by effectively banning all forms of protesting in certain locations where those rights, frankly, ought to be protected. Now, in 2021, the Ontario Liberals and NDP both introduced opposition bills calling for bubble zones around hospitals, schools, and daycares. That bill did not pass, but Quebec passed a bubble zone banning protests near hospitals and schools. These were all triggered by protests related to COVID-19. Now, in Ottawa last year, there was a proposal by a school board trustee and pro-mask advocate named Nilly Kaplan-Mirth. She wanted to ban protests outside of schools. I mean, she is a sort of famous COVID warrior in Canada, but her concern about protests around schools, in that case, actually was she didn't want protests about critical gender theory being taught in schools. So she wanted a bubble zone law to ban that. And it doesn't end there. They keep going. In 2023, Calgary passed the Safe and Inclusive bylaw, which prohibits, quote, specified protests within 100 meters of a library or community center. This one is especially egregious because it bans protests based on the subject matter of the protests. So you could have a protest near a library or community center about taxes, labor issues, the environment, things like that, but not about issues related to race. So think Black Lives Matter protests, about gender. So think protests about Drag Queen Story Hour, or about disability. So think protests about drug legalization, even either for or against, which is addiction as a disability issue. So that is a really problematic law, which we actually are challenging the hearings in 2025. So I have a bunch of videos about that particular Calgary bylaw as well. But look, it's not just municipalities, it's not just provinces that are enacting these problematic bubble zone laws. The federal government has joined the bubble club. In 2023, the Trudeau government passed Bill C-3, which prevents protests that obstruct access to hospitals and healthcare facilities, which of course is redundant because anything that is a blockade could already be dealt with using existing law. There have also been calls for bubble zones that have not yet happened. Most recently, Toronto City Councillor Brad Bradford and Vaughan Mayor Stephen Del Duca have both separately called for bubble zones around places of worship. But I think it's the most recent one by Marco Mendocino, this Liberal MP, that is the cherry on top for me. So Mendocino has suggested adding politicians' offices to this already lengthy list of places where protests are banned. On July 18th, he told the Canadian press that the government should establish, quote, protective zones around the offices for members of parliament. And under his proposal, anyone who, quote, intimidated or otherwise harassed people within the buffer zone of perhaps 50 to 100 meters would be subject to harsher criminal penalties, including jail time. So don't like your MP, jail for you. Like, come on, enough with the bubble zones. As more and more spaces come under this umbrella of bubbles that prevent speech and protest, our cities are moving closer to becoming one giant bubble where expression of dissent or discord is only permitted in, small, special little protest zone envelopes. And to be clear, all bubble zones are a problem. As I've said, I don't like the banning of protests near abortion clinics either, even though they have been upheld by the courts. I think criminal activity and harassment, if it's taking place, it can be dealt with using existing law. But the rationale that the court used to uphold the abortion bubble zones in the Lewis case, it just doesn't apply to these more recent expansions that began in 2020. The new bubble zone laws are generally, but not always, in response to vitriolic speech that some of that speech may or may not be worthy of social condemnation, but vitriolic speech is obviously constitutionally protected by our charter. The more recent bubble zones have also not yet faced court scrutiny, and I would say they're fundamentally different. Let's look at how they're different by considering the Calgary bylaw that I mentioned that bans specified protests near libraries and community centers. As I said, we are challenging that particular bylaw with a hearing scheduled in early 2025. So here's a big part of the difference. Unlike abortion clinics, community centers and libraries can be and are used to host political debates during elections. I mean, the concept of a banning a protest around a political debate is fundamentally undemocratic. Libraries are also centers for learning, for exploration, for discovery, and for competing ideas. This law silences debate, which is really happening in the town square. If the concern is that protests might block people from entering the library, as I've said, that's redundant. Existing laws already prohibit criminal harassment and intimidation, and injunctions can be used to address situations where specific places are being threatened. In fact, I think it's the lack of enforcement of existing laws that is in part fueling the demand for bubble zones. The desire for these, speech-free zones comes from a desire, I think, if I'm giving the best faith interpretation of why people want these, is because they want to protect who they perceive as vulnerable people. Like the example I gave of violence around abortion clinics, there have been physical threats of violence and property damage that have targeted Jewish communities and synagogues and Jewish schools. And Jewish people and children are facing an unprecedented wave of anti-Semitism and threats. And this is, of course, noxious. This is a huge societal concern. But bubble zones will not cure anti-Semitism. We have existing laws that deal with criminal harassment, intimidation, road blockades, the occupation of property, and the incitement of violence and hatred. The police do not need more tools. They need to use the tools that they already have, but have really shown an unwillingness to actually deploy. This has been a big part of the problem with anti-Semitic protests in Toronto, is that the police don't actually take action using the tools that they have. When the concern is violence, like the example I gave of violence around abortion clinics, the police really need to enforce existing law. Someone who is intent on firebombing a synagogue, a criminal and violent act, they're not going to think, oh, well, I better not commit arson because there's a bubble zone. Arson is already a serious offense. So the police, what they need to do is stop people from committing arson, not create this bubble zone. But if we're going to agree The people who want bubble zones, they're arguing for these bubble zones in order to protect vulnerable groups. I think if we take that as the rationale, it just does not hold. It completely falls apart when politicians are asking for bubble zones to protect them. Politicians are not a vulnerable group, and protesting the politicians who make our laws is part of how democracy works. It's often the most marginalized people in our society who do resort to protest in order to have their voices heard by people in power, like politicians. Politicians are powerful people. They are not vulnerable people. So Mendocino's proposal to criminalize protests near politicians' offices is to shield the political class from different viewpoints that they should be exposed to. And this is not just a proposal to silence political dissent. It's an undemocratic proposal. It's unconstitutional. And I think it's frankly dangerous. So enough already. Stop with the bubble zones. If you want to follow our legal challenge to the Calgary bubble zone, I have a bunch of videos related to that you can check out. I will link to them below in the description. You can also follow along as that Calgary case progresses by subscribing to our email freedom updates at the ccf.ca/freedom updates. So what is your take on bubble zones? Do you think things have gone too far? Are cities going to eventually just be one big bubble zones with protests relegated to a tiny patch of grass where no one sees the protest? That would be bad for speech and democracy, in my opinion, but I want to know what you think. So leave a comment below telling me what you think of these expanded bubble zone laws. Did you know that they had expanded so rapidly and into so many different areas in the last 4 years? Let me know below what you think of that expansion and what you think is coming next on the bubble zone frontier. Okay, that's all for this update. Thanks for watching, and let's keep fighting for freedom in Canada.